Hi, I'm Neil Nobel, editor-at-large of the Prickly Pear, and welcome to the Cactus Patch. Our guest today is Alan Korwin. Alan, welcome.
Nice to be with you, Neil.
It's hard to give a short introduction to Alan Korwin. He is an author, a publisher, an editor, a musician, an entrepreneur, a civil rights activist. He is the publisher, the largest publisher in the country of gun law books, has written numerous articles, has appeared on radio and television over 1,000 times. He is probably the national expert on where we are right now in the civil rights movement to protect our Second Amendment. And Alan, I'd like to first start by just talking about there's kind of two tracks that we're seeing right now. We're seeing the threat from government. We're seeing the threat now from private actors. Would you kind of bring our listeners and viewers up to date as to where we are in the fight to protect our Second Amendment rights?
I'd be glad to, Neil. One small correction. I am an expert, but not the expert. There's a lot of us out there. We know each other. We talk to each other. We're all working to preserve our freedoms, and they are definitely in jeopardy from many places, not just two tracks. You mentioned government and the private sector. What is the main threat to liberty? Where do the main threats to liberty come from? And it's government. Government is supposed to protect our liberties. If you read the Declaration of Independence, that's the purpose of government, is to protect our freedoms and then leave us free to do what free people do, which is the great America you see before you. But government is also the source of genocide throughout history, and we're seeing it now. And government is also the source of all the restrictions on your freedoms. The Constitution lays out the limited delegated powers that government has. And at this point in time, government has usurped powers it clearly is not supposed to have. And the public rants against it, bridles underneath that yoke, and we're struggling. There are things they are strictly not supposed to do. Congress shall make no law, and my libertarian friends think there should be a period right there. So, and yet they make laws saying or they pronounce edicts saying you can't go to church because there's a disease, and you can't assemble unless you're rioting for Black Lives Matter, and then it's okay. And they're out of control, they're illogical, irrational, and what do? The founders armed us all so we could resist that kind of usurpation and tyranny. But then the questions I get, I'm the editor of the Bill of Rights Sentinel newsletter for a group called Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership, which was formed after the Holocaust to literally preserve our right to keep and bear arms so we would have a balance of power. And people ask me, as the editor and as a member of JPFO and as a Second Amendment activist, who do you shoot? Who do you use these guns for or against? How do you use your armed strength to prevent government from being so out of control? And there really is no answer. And the Democrats, recognizing that there's an armed public that could stand in the way of their usurpation of power and exercise of power completely outside their delegated authority, have armed the Capitol, put up fences, brought in the National Guard, because they suspect people will not want to obey laws that aren't laws, and they're passing them left and right. I made a note here of two of the most egregious bills they have now concerning your firearms, which would literally disarm the public if they enact them and they found some way to enforce them. The laws are just absolutely bizarre. So there you are on the government side of things.
Right.
On the private side, and I'm a reporter, I'm a journalist, I have credits and credentials in my wallet. I've been writing as the uninvited ombudsman since 2006. What is that, 14, 15 years now, looking at what the media is doing and commenting on it. And I probably don't have to tell your audience that the news media is out of control and isn't really news media anymore. Some of the larger ones are basically propagandists,
Yeah.
almost like Pravda, or maybe better than Pravda was. They are not reporting accurately. The public is misinformed. The education system is doing what the Communist Party promised in the 1950s to take over education, the media, the arts, and to mislead the public into believing things that aren't so. So we have corporations now backing literally Marxist programs, donating money to, for instance, Black Lives Matter, which
Yeah.
is allied with Antifa, that the media does not inform you about, but if you look hard, you can see it. And they're pouring money into these groups whose purpose is to undermine the fundamental principles that the United States is built on as having a deleterious effect. We're seeing week after week after month of riots, rape, arson, pillage, destruction, and no consequence, and a small demonstration with horrible results in the Capitol that gets nothing but swamp-filled coverage that doesn't stop and no balance. Where are the reporters? We see literally lies to our face from people who aren't challenged. Wolf Blitzer and Anderson Cooper and Don Lemon lie, distort, provide answers to the people they're interviewing, and then the people parrot them. So do you think this is a really bad thing? Yes, I think this is a really bad thing. You can see it for yourself. They ask or questions. Or, that's a key word. Do you think Donald Trump is an idiot or a moron? Those are the choices. And you can see they're propagandists. They have an agenda. So the public isn't informed. They don't even know that the Second Amendment's main purpose is balance of power, not duck hunting, which they keep talking about. The ducks are coming. The ducks are coming. That is not what Paul Revere was about. It's that we have power and the government has power, and it's a balance of power that keeps us free. In communist China, if you're found with a gun, you're executed. In America, if you're found with a gun, somebody asks, hey, that's a nice gun. What kind is it? Where'd you get it? How much did you pay? I always wanted one of those because it's normal. It's like having a Bible or a book. Firearms are normal here, but the media is now trying to cast them as a public health hazard. Well, guns aren't germs. Owning firearms isn't a public health hazard. And corporations are starting to adopt this by being drummed over the head with these bad messages nonstop. And so they're pulling their business back from businesses that are involved in keeping the public safely and happily armed. You mentioned a point or two before we got started, but under Obama, they had the credit card agencies pulling banking away from any company at retail that was selling firearms to the public. It's a
They,
wholesome business. It's a
they
good
also
business.
attempt to restrict credit to firearms companies and gun stores as well, not just to customers and so forth.
They cut off the credit lines to manufacturers, to retail stores. It's discriminatory. It's illegal. They did it anyway. Who's supposed to stop that? Or as people keep asking me, who do you shoot? And there's no answer to that. You can't, who do you shoot? The guns are worthless when the media is stacked against you, the government is stacked against you. There's nobody at your door confiscating a firearm, which they probably won't do because the authorities and the armed portion of the authorities are not going door to door. It's like, heck with that. I'm not going around to try and take guns away from people, which
And,
let me go ahead.
and while this process has been going on, it's been going on for a couple of years. There's also a story that is not being covered very much, and that is there's an absolute shortage of firearms and particularly ammunition right now. And apparently the American people sense something, and it's not discussed very much. I mean, I've seen people discuss the supply side. You know, their COVID has caused supply chain issues. Remington went out of business. It hurt primer production, so on and so forth. But we have, you know, the Russians, the Czechs, the Mexicans, and many other domestic sources of ammunition, yet it's 9mm basically quadrupled in price if you can find it. There's a
Right.
story there. The government is giving us one story, but the American public scents quite another story. And they are stocking up and arming themselves to an extent I don't think you and I have ever seen in our lifetime. What is that backstory?
Well, under Obama, we had a similar problem. They used to joke that Obama was the best gun salesman we've ever had. You've probably heard that. We're seeing the same thing. And I've spoken with manufacturers. They're running 3 shifts in some cases, and they can't keep up with demand. It's strictly supply and demand. And a lot of people have enough ammunition to last their lives. But it really comes down to, what do you need all the ammunition for? One of the contractors I work with brags to me about how many 1,000 rounds of ammo he has and how many guns he has. And I have to say, Mike, you can only shoot one at a time. What are you going to do with them all? And here's a little side note on that. You only think you're armed if the other guy's wearing body armor. And you don't face one totalitarian agent. You face 8 men on a dynamic entry team with machine guns that you're no longer allowed to get in any reasonable way. They all have machine guns and a helicopter overhead. And when your house is destroyed with you in it and they kill your dog, the media is going to say one crazy radical was eliminated from his compound, and the public cheers. You know, let me give you a different sidelight. Oath keepers are now in the spotlight as this anti-American horrible thing. And some of them are former police officers and former military. I've spoken to this group on a number of occasions. They've asked me to come in and speak. I speak all over the country. And if any of your listeners want me to speak, I'm glad to do it. They can reach me through you. Oath keepers' main purpose is to honor the oath they took as police officers and military. And it's an oath to honor, to protect, preserve, and defend the United States Constitution. And the Constitution is the bedrock we're built upon. And as I started, the Democrats especially, but the Republicans as well, are not honoring the Constitution. They're making things up as they go. They're deciding, well, this would be a good idea, so let's do it. But wait a minute, you're not delegated that authority. You don't have the power to ban ammunition, popular firearms. They have machine guns and they want to stop you from having a one-shot rifle like an AR-15, which is the most popular common rifle in use today. So even a one-shot rifle is too much for them to let you have. If you read these new bills, Neil, the idea the Democrats have, if I can encapsulate it in a few words, guns are okay as long as they don't work. One of these bills requires that if you have a gun, it has to be unloaded and locked up. So you can have it, but it doesn't work. And you can load it and unlock it while you're under attack. Now, that was the key in the Heller case in 2008. And I was invited to the US Supreme Court to observe that case. And I wrote an entire book, The Heller Case, about that. And the whole point was there was a private cop who worked in federal offices who kept a gun at home. And he kept it loaded and not locked up, so it was usable. But Washington, D.C. had a law that said you got to keep it unloaded and locked up. But if you're being attacked, while the attack is on, then you can load it. And the Supreme Court decided that's clearly infringement. That law can't stand, and they overturned it in a 5-4 vote, one vote. So that is illegal by the Supreme Court standard. That's illegal by any rational standard as far as I'm concerned. And now the Democrats who control both houses and the presidency want to reintroduce it, even though the Supreme Court found it illegal and logic says it's illegal. So they want to make it so that any gun you have, they want to know exactly where it's located, and it's got to be unloaded and locked up. So guns are okay if they don't work. As soon as they work, you're a felon. even though you didn't do anything.
Well, besides disabling the guns, they're working another track that is disabling us. For instance, mental tests to own a gun, background checks, and various sorts of things where one has to qualify to exercise one's rights.
It's even worse than that. Um, they want psych tests of you, your spouse, anybody in your home, and pretty much anybody you know before you qualify to get a permit to have the guns you already own. You already own. And if you don't pass, everything you own becomes contraband and a felony. And here's something nobody's noticed about these laws. They're not required to issue the permit. And the real ugly part of this is that they think it's okay to require a psych test to anybody, to require a psych test to vote, to own a Bible, to buy red meat or sugar, both of which we know are dangerous. The idea that the federal government, or that the Democrats basically, but the Republicans too, to some extent, think it's okay to require of the public psychology tests by a shrink appointed by the Attorney General, who's appointed, not elected, to test you and say, okay, you're kosher, you're okay, you're blessed, we approve of you so you can own property. That is so fundamentally out of whack. It's okay in a communist country, and we're following a lot of communist principles now, and we're bowing down to China, which the former president, Trump, stood against, and the current president has a son who's getting paid by those guys. I don't know how he got clearance to be in the White House, but that's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah.
So is it okay, aside from the gun issue, is it okay for the Attorney General to require a psychology test of you and everybody around you before you can do anything? Forget guns.
We've had a couple of local jurisdictions make the argument, almost the sanctuary city type argument, that they would not enforce such federal laws within their jurisdiction. Do you think that has any legs or any power?
I'm glad you brought that up, because you asked me, what can we do about this? One of the best things to come out of this is the sanctuary policy movement. And it's not just a suggestion. There are a whole bunch of states that have introduced and passed sanctuary policies. Now, what sanctuary policies say is that the gun rights you currently have are a baseline, and anything that detracts or removes the rights you have is null and void, because the Constitution establishes a ban on infringement. Congress shall make no law, and the people have a right, and infringement is banned. So whatever gun rights you have now, wherever you are, there it is. It's good, it's legal, and anything the federal government does or the state does that reduces those rights is banned. It's null and void.
Speaking of
What's that?
Speaking of the state, the Arizona Constitution actually is a little stronger on the Second Amendment than the federal Constitution, is it not?
That's true. And other states have a stronger Second Amendment armed citizen protection in their constitutions. And 7 states don't have anything on arms in their constitutions. Well, Montana just passed sanctuary policy. Arizona has it in both houses. I don't have it up on my website, gunlaws.com, but I have similar things up. I've circulated it in my newsletter, page 9. We'll have it in the Bill of Rights Sentinel. You don't have to be Jewish to join Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership, but those folks get it because of what they've been through.
Why don't we give our listeners right now some appropriate websites so they can see your writing and see JPFO and so forth?
I appreciate that. JPFO.org, Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership, covers a lot of these topics, jpfo.org. And my website, gunlaws.com, has a lot of this information. it's getting hard to keep up with it all, but I do. And I have a newsletter I put out periodically, page9.org. And you can just look up my name, Korwin, Korwin, and you'll find a ton of material. I'm working on a sanctuary policy with some legislators to help draft the legislation. Some of it is good, some of it is weak. I want to see a real hold their feet to the fire clause, because if you infringe on somebody's rights, if you propose an infringement or you actually infringe on somebody's rights, you should go to prison. It's a denial of civil rights, and you can't do that. It's like saying no blacks at the lunch counter. Remember when we had that in the 50s? Blacks can't drink from this water fountain. It used to be no coloreds. Now it's no people of color, and they think that's not racist. But if you said no colored people, that would be racist, as if the preposition of hides the left's racism. So they talk about people of color all the time instead of colored people, and this hides the racism that's in almost everything they do. Well, no guns, or we don't want your kind here because you carry a firearm or you believe in the Second Amendment. That's discrimination. That's anti-civil rights. And if a legislator does that, that legislator should be bounced out of office. And in my opinion, that should be as much of a crime as stopping a black person from eating or traveling or anybody. And it is. So we want civil rights laws that ban infringement and carry penalties in the sanctuary policies.
You know, as we talk, so many things fly through my head, what we've seen over the last year or two develop. But another area that strikes me is the Democrats have proposed that many things that previously were crimes are not crimes.
Yes.
They have attorney generals that have been put into office with Soros money that refuse to prosecute.
True.
At the same time, they're trying to disarm the American public. It seems to me almost a calculated policy to make us vulnerable to criminal elements. Do you think I'm going too far with that?
If I said yes, I could be attacked for that. So I won't say yes, but I don't think you're wrong. And attributing that kind of motive is hard. So let's just attribute the results. They're weakening us. They're destroying our moral fabric. One of the goals of the communists, which is in the federal record, was to destroy the family unit, which would undermine our principles. So now a family doesn't have to have a mother and father, which is traditional throughout history.
Yeah.
And they're funding fatherless homes with welfare. And we've got 70% of Black children born out of wedlock or with no father. This does not help. All the sociological studies show children are raised better when they have at least two parents. And you need the influence of a man and a woman. But now there's 30 genders. So what's a man? What's a woman? It's insane. It's all coming from the left, which is another way of saying communists and socialists. And they promised to do this. Nikita Khrushchev said, we'll bury you and you'll hoist the communist flag yourselves. And we're seeing it happen. So is it deliberate, Neil? I can't tell. I haven't been in on those meetings. But I wouldn't be surprised if they're sitting there laughing, going, ha, 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 we're succeeding, because it sure looks that way. And whether it is or not, we need to do this. Here's a law we should have. You've got to teach firearm safety and marksmanship in school to get federal funding. If you deny 10% of the Bill of Rights, or 30%, if you want to count the 9th Amendment and the 10th Amendment, if you deny 30% in the school curriculum, you don't get any federal funds. You have to teach marksmanship. And if you want to get a high school diploma, you have to be able to shoot straight and handle a gun safely. I don't see anything wrong with that. It's traditional. It's a fundamental part of this. And although the media constantly talks about guns and crime, they almost never talk about guns save lives. Guns stop crime. Guns are good. Guns protect you. Why do you think we give guns to the police? Guns protect our borders. Although now the Democrats are making sure that that doesn't happen. So we're being flooded. We need borders. How do you protect your border? There's only one way any country does that, with arms. And there's a reason for that. Guns are good. Guns are good. You know, guns are also fun. In the last Olympics, we won more gold medals in the firearms competitions than in any other competition. But you didn't know that because
Oh,
they don't
drugs are given
report on it.
no coverage on television when they cover the Olympics. That's for sure.
They
Alan,
leave
in the
that out.
interest,
And here's a fact. Let me hit you with one more fact and then ask me your next question. The shooting sports, a term you never hear in the media, the shooting sports are the #2 participant sport in the entire country. It's bigger than golf by sales. The shooting sports. People are at the ranges, they buy guns, they buy ammo, they hunt, they target shoot. It's the #2 participant sport. And yet the media gives it no coverage at all. So is that bias? You bet it's bias. Is that prejudice? Absolutely. When reporters ask me about this, I ask them, when was the last time you were at the range? And they stammer and they stutter and, well, I don't own a gun. They're dangerous. Guns are supposed to be dangerous, and you're supposed to be an adult and able to handle it.
as we look at the current firearms boom right now, I have read, I can't verify, that upwards of 40% of the new purchases are coming from women. Are you seeing that kind of data?
I've spoken to gun store operators, and they're not surprised, but they have also noticed a lot of the purchases are from women. A lot of the purchases are from newcomers who have no experience, which goes back to teaching gun safety in schools.
Right.
You shouldn't be able to get out of high school without understanding which end of a gun is dangerous, what the 3 safety rules are, knowing how to safely discharge a firearm. But because we're free people, you can just go and buy a gun or a Bible, both dangerous, we know that, and run around that way. So women, new gun owners, and this is happening everywhere. Gun store owners report it, and it's actually a good trend. Also, a lot of women, this is happening in the Jewish community. I was speaking with her, and he says, what we're seeing is the woman telling the husband to go buy a gun and figure it out. So we have a gun in the house. Now, sometimes it's the one, I wrote a book on this called Your First Gun. And guns aren't for everybody. Some people don't want it. They're afraid. It's ignorance, or they just don't want it. That's fine. But sometimes it's the spouse who doesn't want it and a spouse who does. And very often it's the man who wants it and the woman who doesn't, or the woman who wants it and the man who doesn't. And that's something they have to resolve between themselves.
Just in the interest of time, I'd like to conclude a little bit on what we can do right now to protect our Second Amendment civil rights. It appears that many of us had relied on the National Rifle Association, which seems to be disintegrating due to its own internal corruption at a very critical time. And I hate to say this, but I'm going to say it. I take quite umbrage at the self-serving attitude some people on the board of the NRA when they're talking about protecting our rights, and they've been more interested in padding their pocketbook. Given the state of the NRA right now, what is the best way, in your opinion, that our viewers can support their Second Amendment rights?
You certainly want to join your state association and other national associations. And I'm not going to comment on the NRA's problems and strengths. It's got a lot of both. JPFO, being a organization with Jew in its name, Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership, has a real moral imperative to do whatever it can. And one of their mottos is, we make the NRA look like moderates, because they were almost wiped out. And they really have a moral imperative. There are rabbis who are members, and they say, you don't have to be Jewish to join, you just have to love liberty. So JPFO is an organization that can use the support. And there's a dozen other groups. The Second Amendment Foundation is suing all the government, not all, many of the government agencies that are usurping power. Gun Owners of America, based in the Washington, D.C. area in Virginia, is doing excellent work. And your state association is really the rubber on the road at a local level. But the main thing to do is for you personally to get active and just go to the range, dust off your firearms and practice. It gives you bragging rights when you go out to lunch the next day. Where were you? "Oh, I was at the range." Really? And that starts a conversation. Bring a friend with you, especially one who's never fired a gun or one who hasn't gone in a while, and you get a certain amount of juice flowing that's really good. Read more. Go to my website. I'll get you energized if you haven't figured that out. And do what, Neil, what you and I do. We get together in a political salon where we discuss these issues, we get ideas, we write articles. Although I'm a writer for 30 years, I don't really promote the idea of write letters to your Congress people. It's okay, but they tally them up 1 for, 1 against, 2 for, 1 against. That helps. You do better to pick up the phone and speak to somebody because that really moves things, or go to meetings where your legislators are and see them face to face, even with a mask on, and talk to them and get a sense of what they're up to. Now you're really having an impact.
I think those are all good suggestions. And I don't mean to be too critical of the NRA, but I guess they were pretty much absent during the last election cycle due to their own internal difficulties and their own legal bills. And I'm glad to see these other organizations picking up the slack, because I don't know if the NRA is going to return to the powerhouse it once was. I hope they do. They were very effective at one time, but right now they seem entangled in their own internal affairs to a great extent, and that's unfortunate.
They're also the main power we have at the federal government level. But GOA, Gun Owners of America, is also there full force. And the Second Amendment Foundation is also operating there full strength. And believe it or not, the Virginia Citizens Defense League, VCDL, is a powerhouse in that area because they're in Virginia. They're very large. They're very well equipped and knowledgeable, and deal with your own local cadre of politicians. But keep this in mind. It's not really the Republicans versus the Democrats anymore. It's government versus you.
Right.
Your taxes keep going up. The laws keep getting passed. The debt keeps expanding. The problem is bigger than Congress. The problem is the public doesn't get it. Get involved in education if you can, but the educators are completely out of whack. And dealing with Congress isn't going to help the fact that teachers are terrified of guns because they're ignorant. They won't allow a student to point a chicken leg or a finger. JPFO invented something called goody guns, which were cookie cutters in the shape of guns. So a child could learn, eat it from the handle forward to understand that the muzzle is the dangerous part, and teachers freaked out. So you've got to get to teachers. They're a big piece of this too.
Oh, the schools are a big part of this, no doubt about it. This is such a huge subject. We could probably talk all morning. Alan, I really do appreciate your time. I hope we can come back and revisit many of these issues with you again soon.
I'm here for you, Neil. You let me know.
Thank you, Alan. Appreciate it very much.
My pleasure.